This week on the Communicators, our guest is Robert McDowell, Republican Commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission.
And we're pleased to welcome back to the Communicators FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell, the lead Republican on the 5-member commission. Commissioner McDowell, we talked with your colleague Michael Copps last week, and I want to ask you the same question that we asked him to begin, which was regarding the AT&T T-Mobile transaction. What do you see as the timetable for this to be considered, and what's the biggest impediment you see to this transaction happening?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. It's allergy season here in Washington, so excuse me if I have to clear my throat a few times today. But yeah, I don't comment substantively on prospective mergers, but I'm happy to talk about process, which is if you look at some other recent big mergers in the past few years, they take anywhere from a year to a year and a half, really, functionally speaking, at the FCC. So I would look for that sort of time frame. We've been told by the parties that we should expect an application to be filed at the FCC soon, within the next week or two, and then the clock starts ticking. Of course, Congress is going to want to take a look at this as well. I imagine the Commerce and Judiciary Committees of each House of Congress will probably have hearings on this, so it'll be heavily scrutinized.
Have you talked with AT&T or T-Mobile representatives at
Yes,
this point?
they came into my office the Wednesday after the announcement and met with me.
What about Sprint or Verizon?
We have not yet met on this proposed merger, but I imagine once it's actually filed, I will be meeting with all of the interested parties.
And again, I want to show one little piece of video of Michael Copps last week talking about potential conditions on the merger and get your response.
But I would hope if there is going to be a majority at the commission that is going to approve of this, that we would be obviously looking at market by market and what divestitures might be called for. That's certainly important. I think certainly the open internet, network neutrality is important. And just looking at the level of concentration and market power across the board is important. So it comes down to all of the considerations that go into deciding whether this serves the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That's our charge in this. So it's a pretty wide-ranging charge that we have under the statute, and I hope that we will fulfill it.
Commissioner.
So, yeah, I've served for almost 5 years with Mike Copps and known him for even longer than that, and I have a high regard and respect for him. So he's absolutely right when he says that our standard is the public interest standard. That's what Congress has told us we need to do. It's sort of a broad but amorphous standard, different from what the antitrust agencies have. Everyone's assuming it'll be the Department of Justice, but it could also be a Federal Trade Commission, and I've never quite figured out exactly how the possession arrow works as to who gets these mergers. But those agencies look at the antitrust perspective of mergers, any merger. And when you look at the wireless market, you do have to look at it market by market. It's a geographic market, product markets as well. So it's complicated and complex, but I hope we can give it a full and fair airing and do it as quickly as possible.
Joining us also is Lynn Stanton with Telecommunications Reports. She's a senior editor there. Lynn.
Thank you. As you mentioned, the FCC public interest standard is rather amorphous. What do you look for? What is it, a balancing act of what it does that's positive, what it does that's negative? What kind of factors and considerations do you look for in weighing the public interest in a merger?
In a merger. So you really have to look to what, the way I approach them is, are there any harms coming about as a result of the merger? So what are those specific harms to consumers? And if there are harms, then merger conditions should be narrowly tailored to address those. But the merger process should not be an excuse to implement rulemakings of issues that don't arise because of that particular merger. So I think Commissioner Baker gave a tremendous speech on this in February, and I wholeheartedly support what she said there.
Typically, the antitrust regulators, Justice and FTC, their remedies tend to be one-time divestiture kinds of remedies, whereas the FCC tends to quite frequently impose sort of ongoing business practice prohibitions or mandates. And what is your view of that? Is that really the only path the FCC has in terms of trying to get at the kinds of issues that are public interest issues as opposed to competitive issues?
Well, you're right in that, first of all, the antitrust agencies or the DOJ, for instance, can actually sue to stop a merger, and that's exactly what their ultimate remedy is. But they try to get the parties to agree ahead of time for a divestiture or other conditions like that. And so you say it's one time, but a divestiture can be rather permanent and long-standing as
But
well.
it doesn't
has
mean
lasting
oversight, I
effects.
guess, is what I was getting at. You do it and it's kind of done.
Sure, they're not the regulatory agency for these industries, for these companies ongoing. But in an FCC context, historically what's happened is the FCC would, if they impose conditions, would impose conditions that the parties are agreeing to voluntarily ahead of time. And of course, there is the opportunity for coercion. So companies, I think, come to the FCC and the Department of Justice realizing there's going to be a transaction cost or regulatory cost. That's the cost of doing business. And whether that's good public policy or not is another matter for debate, but that is historically what has happened.
One of the conditions that Michael Copps discussed with regard to AT&T T-Mobile was the issue of net neutrality. Now, on the House floor this week, Representative Marsha Blackburn, a Republican of Tennessee, spoke about net neutrality, which the House is looking at this week.
Net neutrality is the federal government stepping in and saying, we're going to come first, we're going to assign priority and value to content. It basically is the fairness doctrine for the internet. As I said, there has been no market failure and there is no need for this government overreach. So many are saying, why do this? It's one of those issues of power and control. Government wanting to dictate what speed you will have, how often you will be on, the type internet service that you will have, being able to control that.
So I was actually just in Nashville last week with Congressman Blackburn, and we did a town hall together, and she spoke almost those exact same words there as well, and she's been a very passionate leader on this issue. When she says there's nothing broken, I wholeheartedly agree. There is nothing broken in this space. You know, I had a very long dissent back in December on this issue, and I feel not only is there nothing broken, but the FCC just didn't have the legal authority to do what it's doing. It's defying a court order from almost exactly a year ago, as well as in the last Congress we had a large bipartisan majority of Congress. Those are words when strung together. We don't hear them strung together very often these days, but a large bipartisan majority of Congress, about 302 members of Congress by my count, who wrote to the FCC and in one form or another said either don't do it or don't do it this way or have Congress handle it. So if this is going to be a public policy issue, it really should be addressed at the congressional level. And so I think Congress is trying to address it, or at least the House is, through the Congressional Review Act.
So if you were in the majority on an FCC decision and Congress decided to negate that decision, what would your view be?
Well, you raise a good point, which is some of these things are outcome-based. So just because someone likes the outcome, the policy outcome of a particular order by an agency, you still have to respect the process. So, for instance, I would love to see the federal government have a balanced budget, but the FCC obviously does not have the authority to impose a balanced budget on the federal government. We had a vote yesterday, which was interesting, on data roaming. I think it's very important for consumers to be able to make sure that their 4G phones can roam on other carriers' networks, and we want to encourage carriers to reach agreements, contractual agreements with each other. But I just didn't feel the FCC had the legal authority to do that. In fact, there's an explicit statutory prohibition, a section called 332 of the Communications Act, that prohibited the FCC from doing what it did yesterday. So you may like an outcome, but you have to respect the process. That's why it's there. We can't exceed our authority, even if it's a good idea.
Following on to that idea of respecting authority, now that a rule is in place, whether it's data roaming or the net neutrality rules, once they're published, there's a lengthy process that still has to go through for them to be effective. Assuming that the House and the Senate don't manage to pass through this Congressional Review Act resolution that would overturn them, and assuming that a court does not get around to staying or overturning them in time before the first complaint comes up before the FCC under these net neutrality rules, how do you, as someone who dissented from the net neutrality rules, or if there were a data roaming complaint, as someone who dissented from data roaming, how do you approach those kinds of issues of facts and disputes under rules that you yourself oppose?
Excellent question. So you're saying there's a rule I oppose. It's the law of the land, though, until it gets overturned in court. And so what do we do? So that's going to be fact specific. You know, I do think there will be a number of complaints filed at the FCC under the net neutrality rules, and we'll see where those facts lead us. You have to look at the law, and you have to look at the facts, and when you start straying from those principles, that's when things can get sticky and you can get inconsistent. But you know, the most common request we actually get at the FCC, when you boil it all down, is please regulate my rival. And I think that's what's going on in net neutrality and a number of things that we see.
One area of please regulate my rival that we sometimes hear from, or please regulate the other guys in terms of opponents of net neutrality, they'll sometimes bring up, well, why aren't you applying these to Google and to other content providers? And I would imagine pretty soon we'll be hearing, why aren't you applying it to Netflix? Because they seem to be becoming the content provider du jour in terms of being the other side in this whole issue. Why aren't these rules applied to Google? Do you think, or Netflix, do you think they should be applied to them? And how would you go about? I can see how you would apply transparency, but some of the other aspects of net neutrality, I'm not sure how much sense they make if you're not really running a network. So where do you stand on that issue?
Let me describe a company to you. It's got thousands of miles of fiber. It's got servers and soft switches. It offers voice, video, and data services. And so is that company AT&T? Is it Google? Is it Verizon? Or is it Microsoft? And the answer, of course, is it's all of the above. And so if, from a network perspective, an engineer's perspective, if you start diagramming what these companies look like, they look very similar. So I think this actually calls for a Telecom Act rewrite and more of a reliance on competition law than it does relying on 75-year-old sort of stovepipes. We're going to treat phone companies one way and cable companies another way and wireless companies yet another way, when technology and the marketplace have moved well past those antiquated stovepipes. That's a fundamental issue. I think it's an excellent question, but I don't think the Internet Network Management regulations that I dissented against in December should be applied because A, there's no problem, B, there are other laws in the books that already protect consumers, C, there is I think the certainty of unintended consequences and unintended harms actually that can come about. I wouldn't want to see them applied unless we can really find evidence of some systemic market failure.
Do you see an appetite for telecom rewrite?
You know, it took, so the AT&T, the old Ma Bell monopoly was broken up in about 1984. It took about 12 years for the 1996 rewrite to come about as a result of that. And it takes a very long time. I think over time, yeah, I think there'll have to be one because it's such a fundamental part of our economy. And it's really, telecommunications provides the rails, so to speak, on which the entire economy rides. And we want to have as much innovation and constructive experimentation and constructive risk-taking in that sector of the economy as possible. You know, by some estimates, the FCC oversees about 1/6 of the economy, the same slice of the pie as healthcare. That's well over $2 trillion, but it really reverberates and affects all aspects of the economy. So as technology continues to move, we have to continue, I think, to look at whether we have rules on the books, laws on the books, that might be slowing innovation and experimentation down, and get rid of them and backstop them with competition law.
Any specific laws come to mind that, in your view, stifles innovation?
Well, so for instance, if we're going to start treating the wireless industry like the old wireline monopoly industry, I think that's going to cause real problems, and that thus far appears in the past 2 years to be where we're headed. You know, Congress very consciously, with the 1996 Act, had a hands-off approach when it came to wireless. And what we saw was a tremendous explosion of entrepreneurial brilliance in the wireless industry. We saw rates come down, we saw functionality and innovation go up, and investment go up. And now the penetration rate, there's we have over 300 million people in the country, but 290 million or so have wireless handsets or subscribers. And so there's more power in the hands of consumers as a result of having that deregulatory approach to that industry. But what we're starting to see now, at least through the FCC, is more of a regulation of the wireless space as a wireline monopoly. And I think that could start to, as one example, start to inhibit innovation and investment.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest this week, Robert McDowell, one of 5 FCC commissioners. Lynn Stanton with Telecommunications Reports, senior editor, is our guest reporter. Lynn.
Short of actually having Congress rewrite the Telecom Act, there are some major reforms that the FCC is looking at in its regulations in terms of the universal service system and the intercarrier compensation system that governs how money is transferred amongst the carriers in the industry. Is this the year that, this has been talked about as long as I can remember, is this the year it finally happens?
I sure hope so. And just to clarify for folks watching at home, our universal service subsidy system is over $8 billion a year. It's one of the largest subsidy programs in the government. It's where one group of telecom users subsidizes another, basically is how it works. Intercarrier compensation is related in that it governs how carriers, telecom companies compensate each other for terminating traffic on each other's networks and things of that nature. In the fall of 2008, there were 4 FCC commissioners out of 5, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I was one, Commissioner Copps was another. We had agreed in principle on many of the intercarrier compensation and universal service issues. Some of these are very thorny and arcane and make people's eyes glaze over, but they're very, very important. It didn't happen then, but I think that provides a very bright ray of hope that we can agree on these things. It's important to show that we can agree on these things, I think, to the American people. It can be a politically charged issue. There are a lot of stakeholders. You have also differences of opinion between the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives tends to represent urban and suburban constituencies who tend to be net payors into this subsidy fund. You have the Senate that tends to represent more rural interests, that tends to be the net recipients of this subsidy. And so it's very difficult for Congress to actually come to agreement on this. But that's our job. We're an independent agency. We're not part of the executive branch. We're not part of the legislative branch. This is why Congress created us in 1934, is to make these tough decisions. We have an explicit mandate to do so under Section 254 of the Telecom Act. And it would be my hope that we can do it and do it before the leaves fall off the trees this year. But I think we should do it holistically. My concern is that we've started looking only at what they call the distribution side as to who gets the subsidy versus the contribution side, which is who is paying for the subsidy. And we still have yet to tee up the notice of proposed rulemaking on who is going to pay for this. And that concerns me. So that's a big caveat.
So you'd rather see them both done together as one action?
Yes, as I've said several times before, as I almost become a cliche, but it's sort of like fixing a watch. It's impossible to fix one part of the watch because it's all interconnected. You have to look at the whole watch and fix it all at the same time.
One of the distribution side proposals that's before the Commission is using reverse auctions in which companies would bid to be allowed to serve a currently broadband unserved area. And the choice, as I understand it, of who actually gets the money, because there wouldn't be enough money to go around, would be based on lowest per capita cost to bring unserved people onto the broadband network. Does that seem like a reasonable way, assuming if you got to doing everything at once the way you want, does that seem like a reasonable way to go? And should there be commitments on the part of these bidders to stay in the market for a certain amount of time, or for this rate that they would charge the end user after getting their subsidy?
First of all, I've been a proponent for reverse auctions in this space. I think it actually would provide a lot of incentives. Congress would have to rewrite the law in order to directly empower consumers through the high cost fund anyway, to basically give you a voucher and then let you decide. We can't do that under the law for the high cost fund. That's another part of the fund does work that way. But I think that does provide an opportunity to create great efficiencies. Right now the program subsidizes multiple competitors in the same market, and that doesn't make any economic sense whatsoever. So we have to, first of all, make sure it's compliant with the law if we were to adopt reverse auctions. I'm hopeful that Chairman Janikowski, the chairman of the FCC, is also on board with this idea and concept. And I think it could really have a great deal of bipartisan support. It does make a lot of the incumbents nervous when we start talking about it, but I think we're at a point where we absolutely have to consider ideas like this because we've gotten to a point where the fund is subsidizing inefficiency and old technology, and we need to end that era.
Well, Commissioner McDowell, another auction idea is the spectrum auction. Now, the White House recently held a spectrum summit. The broadcasters weren't there. Are they being treated fairly in this spectrum discussion that's being held?
Well, first of all, the idea that's been offered up, that was teed up in last year's National Broadband Plan, the chairman's plan, was to have what they call an incentive auction. So for the viewers at home, so if there is a television broadcaster, what sort of financial incentive can be offered to that broadcaster to give up all or part of their spectrum to then have that auctioned off for a wireless carrier or wireless company to offer wireless broadband services. What engineers call the propagation characteristics of the TV spectrum are wonderful. The signals travel a long distance, they can penetrate buildings, and they carry a lot of data with them. So it makes it perfect for wireless broadband. But Congress would have to act to give us the power to have an incentive auction mechanism whereby broadcasters would receive some sort of financial compensation. We have the authority right now for auctions in general of the spectrum, but not to be able to cut the broadcaster a check, let's say. So the idea is the broadcaster would get some money, the Treasury would get the lion's share of the money. But then there's the idea of would it be truly voluntary? And for those broadcasters who aren't participating, they're probably going to be moved. Broadcasters will be moved into a neighborhood of frequencies so that wireless carriers could have a large contiguous block of spectrum, which they need. They need those contiguous blocks in order to operate effectively. So if a broadcaster has to reconfigure their engineering and their equipment, they're going to incur costs. So to be fair, that wouldn't be voluntary by definition for them, but they would have to be compensated at a minimum to try to at least make them whole. So that I think is really, that's what's on the horns of the debate right now, is to how to make it fair and voluntary. We haven't seen a lot of action in Congress on this yet. Here we are recording this on April the 8th. The number of legislative days is quickly, for this year, is quickly dwindling down, especially as Congress is consumed with the budget, government shutdowns, and other such things, and war in Libya and all the rest. So there's a lot that's occupying Congress's mind right now. I'm not saying it won't happen this year, but we're starting to run out of time.
Well, you talked a little bit about Congress and their agenda. We also are approaching, even though it's 2011, a presidential election and another congressional election. Does that affect the FCC?
You know, historically, I think it does. I don't think it should, but I think it does. Sometimes different chairmen have been reluctant to tee up items for a vote in an election year that might be considered controversial. Now, one has to ask is how many votes does that actually affect? What we do, you know, how many voters are actually going to the polls only to vote on an FCC issue? Probably not very many. But again, as to what I said earlier to Lynn, which is that's our job, is to make tough calls when they are delivered to us and when it's appropriate for us to act. And so that should be in an odd-numbered year as well as an even-numbered year.
And you could be facing a four-person commission next year, because typically in an election year it's very hard to get nominations through and confirmations, and Commissioner Copps would have to leave at the end of this year if, or some, you know, and no one would replace him if there were no nomination pushed through. You see that affecting with a 2-2 Republican-Democratic split, because there are issues on which you and Commissioner Baker disagree with the Democrats at times. Do you see that as are there many issues on the plate coming up that you think that would affect?
Very well could. About a third of the time, we did a little analysis a few years ago in my office, actually on this point. About a third of the time, the commission is not at its full 5-member complement, if you look at it historically, and still manages to vote on some big controversial issues. But the premise there, and I understand it's an interesting question, should Commissioner Copps be rolling off, I still have confidence that the President can appoint and the Senate can confirm replacement this year.
Commissioner, what do you think about the new Chief Technology Officer position? How is that the interaction with the FCC?
So we actually, under Chairman Kevin Martin, we had a Chief Technology Officer. The way we've had chief economists, and they come on for a year or two and advise and meet. I think most of those positions tend to deal more directly with the chairman's office than they do the other commissioners' offices, but they're certainly accessible.
I apologize. I meant the White House CTO.
Oh, the White House CTO.
Yes,
okay.
Anish Chopra.
So I've met with Anish. Of course, he's a fellow Virginian. He was our Secretary of Technology under Tim Kaine, Governor Tim Kaine. So I've met him a couple times. He's very knowledgeable, very nice guy. But I don't have really any interaction with that office.
Coming back to the spectrum auction issue, should the FCC be looking further afield than just the broadcasters? One of the arguments for having broadcasters return their spectrum is that there is a higher and better use than using the airwaves to send signals to what is about 15% maybe of homes that might still rely on over-the-air broadcasting. But in the AT&T T-Mobile proposal, AT&T has argued that it can do more by combining the two companies' spectrums than either of them can do alone in terms of speed to getting a next generation broadband to market. Is there spectrum being held by other commercial wireless companies that the same argument could be made at it, that it would be better, more concentrated in larger hands, and should they be offered or induced or invited to take part in these auctions that you may eventually have the authority to hold?
Well, we're actually having this discussion in part because when the iPhone debuted in 2007, the applications on it started to gobble up a lot of the airwaves, right? So anyone who's tried to use an iPhone, let's say in New York, and even AT&T's CEO admits that they have a problem, that those applications are gobbling up and slowing down, gobbling up the airwaves and slowing down your experience. Wireless carriers have said they need more spectrum. Your question is a great one in terms of are companies somehow warehousing spectrum. I think they would put themselves at a competitive disadvantage if they were doing that, and would be at an advantage if they were able to put more spectrum online and use it. So there's a market incentive right now for carriers not to warehouse spectrum, but to actually use it because their customers would be happier if their phones are working faster, right? But I think where we have a lot of potential is with the government. State, local, and federal governments occupy about roughly 1/3 of the airwaves. And I give the administration very high marks actually for looking through the federal warehouse of spectrum to try to bring, by my count, might be off by a little bit, but 180 megahertz worth of spectrum to identify that, to hopefully have us auction that off. Now, not all frequencies in the airwaves are created equally. For broadband, it's better to have something under 1 gigahertz, but technology is advancing. And our spectral efficiency advances every day. So frequencies that we thought maybe 10 or 15 years ago weren't valuable or usable are actually now valuable and usable. And I think that trend should continue for a while. So one silver lining to a spectrum crunch or spectrum exhaustion is that it will spur innovation. We have a lot of technologies coming over the horizon, like smart antenna technology, cognitive radio, software-defined radio, things of that nature that are going to squeeze more efficiency out of the airwaves and really give us new technologies and new abilities we can't even fathom right now. And it's a very, very exciting time in wireless.
Commissioner, one of the biggest users of the spectrum are all the new apps that are out there. Now, when it comes to the issue of privacy and apps, New Jersey is prosecuting or looking at prosecuting a couple of app creators. How much attention is paid to the issue of privacy at the FCC, and do you hear from a lot of Americans about that issue?
The FCC, excellent question. The FCC actually does not have a lot of direct jurisdiction over the privacy issue. That's going to be mainly the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, maybe state privacy laws and their enforcers. Under a section, not to sound too much like a lawyer, 222 of the Communications Act for common carriers, there's customer proprietary information restrictions, and that's kind of our limit on the privacy issue. Now, obviously, peripherally, we operate in that space and have the bully pulpit, but there are other agencies and other laws on the books that govern the privacy issue, which is very important.
Lynn Stanton, one final question.
This is the final one then. The government is facing a possible shutdown as we speak. Are you an accepted employee? Will you be coming into work next week? Will you have staff?
So excellent question. So we are recording this on Friday, April 8th, and a big talk of the shutdown, a potential shutdown, which I'm still optimistic it won't happen. But yes, interestingly, FCC commissioners are considered essential employees, and I say that with a smile on my face because our staffs are not. Now, that's the immediate staff in our office, so each commissioner office has its own staff, and that operates independently from the other commissioner offices. There will be a skeleton crew of essential personnel at the commission, focusing on public safety and the most critical of issues. But all 5 commissioners are supposed to show up for work. But our staffs, it's apparently against the law for them to show up for work. So it's going to make for an interesting day. When I walk into a cold, dark building and have to make some big decisions, we'll see if I have to actually make any, hopefully not.
Robert McDowell, Federal Communications Commission, one of the 2 Republican commissioners. Thank you as always for being on the Communicators. Lynn Stanton, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Sunday on